Number 1. Delivery. When I was in high school and I first began driving, I began driving and doing deliveries for my dad's business. We lived in town, and most of the deliveries would be in town. However, there were definitely orders that sometimes required me to drive out into the more rural areas around. This was about 40 years ago. So it was long before everyone was ordering things online. In order to get some things, my dad would have to order them for his customers, and then have them either picked up or delivered. They were mostly mechanical parts and computer parts, which were a little more difficult to get back then than they are now. Around the time when I had been doing this for about a year, I also began having some issues with a group of guys in school. They would give me a very hard time because I had my dad's car to drive around in, and never would give them rides in it. My dad just forbade that. And he was kind of a guy who could be quite scary when he was pissed off about something. So they started being real jerks to me, especially when they asked and I had to turn them down. So I was getting to looking forward to working more often in my free time. I wasn't dating much at the time, or at all, so I was enjoying the time I had to myself driving. One of the strangest orders was for a computer part that I had gotten with a phone number and no address on it. So I had to call and ask for the delivery address when the part had come in. It turned out that the guy lived really far out in the hills, and had to give me some elaborate directions to get to his place. I was surprised it was so far out, and it was getting dark, so I'd offered to bring the part by the next day. But he offered me a really good tip in order to get it out that night, so I couldn't turn it down. It was already getting dark when I was heading out, and I wasn't used to driving at nighttime. I also didn't drive out into the hills very often, so this was really a new experience for me. I didn't like driving at night because it was hard to see where I was going, and because I would occasionally still be afraid of things in the dark. I was pretty worried about getting lost out there. The roads were very thin, and I was pretty surprised by the time I got to the house. I had to get out with a flashlight and make sure the letters on the old mailbox were the correct ones. There were no lights on at the house inside or out, and it really looked like nobody was there. I was worried that I had gotten it wrong, but the numbers were correct. If there had been a driveway leading up to the house, it had long since grown over. So rather than drive up to the house, I had to walk. I grabbed the part and the flashlight and began to walk up to the dark and scary house. I was walking slowly up to the house, and part of this was because it was just so dark and hard to see, but also because I was trying to put it off as long as possible. A large part of me wanted to just leave the part in the yard and not walk up to the house. Of course then, I wouldn't get the tip that the guy had promised me, and that was literally the only thing that kept me walking up to the house. About halfway up the front yard, however, I did notice a light turn on in the house. I at first felt some relief, but that sort of went away when the front door opened and a dark figure came out onto the porch. I could only see the figure because of the light on behind him, and he was clearly holding some sort of rifle in his hands. I suddenly didn't feel very welcome, but for a few moments, neither of us moved. I finally took another step forward, but no sooner had I done that, but I noticed him pointing the rifle at me. I suddenly strongly suspected this wasn't the same person who I had talked to on the phone just shortly before. I didn't know how to react, but the only thing I wanted to do was run back to the car. I was at first on shaky legs, however, and felt unable to do that. but it didn't take but a moment for the man, or whatever it was, to begin yelling gibberish at me. I really didn't understand anything he was telling me, just that it was all jumbled and scary sounding. I just reacted at that point. I dropped the part into the ground and I ran back to the car as quickly as I could. I kept expecting to get shot in the back on the way out too. Fortunately, no shots came, and I just got back to the car. The man, however, had walked off his front porch and out into the yard, but didn't seem like he was pursuing me really, so I was able to drive off and out of there without ever getting fired at. I was still shaken pretty badly, however. The whole ride until I got home was just terrifying, until I got home and explained everything to my dad about what had happened. I'm not sure how much he believed me at first, but he accepted that I was telling the truth. So, there is a little more to the end of the story. I found out much later what might have happened in this case. A former friend of mine, one who had gotten pissed at one of the other guys who were bullying me, told me that it was a setup to scare the shit out of me or get me shot. One of my friends had ordered the computer part and given me the wrong address to deliver it to. The owner of the house was his great uncle or something like that, and he hated whenever anyone came onto his property. The bully knew at the very least the old man would scare me, but also that I might have gotten fired at. I never confronted the guy on it, because I knew the other guy would deny it if I told that he had told me so. Number 2. Storm. Although I had always grown up in an urban and suburban environment, and liked it, and always felt I would remain in such an environment, there was a short time period in my life where I got really fascinated with the idea of being out in the country, or camping, or just communing with nature in some way or another. I have Native American roots, and I think that although I hadn't paid much mind to them growing up, that they eventually became interesting to me, and I became thus more interested in exploring nature too. I should probably point out that I know not all Native Americans are interested in nature and stuff like that. It was a pretty uneducated belief on my part, but around the time, people always equated being Native American with nature and spiritualism, so I got myself really deeply believing in things like that. I was not experienced with nature or camping or anything like that, but I wanted to go out and try it and see what it was like. A cousin of mine was also into this sort of thing, so we set up a time that the two of us could maybe try and go out camping. The weather was supposed to be absolutely beautiful for a whole week, and that was when we decided to go out and camp. He thought it would be a really good idea to try and camp without tents, but I guess I wasn't quite ready for that, and I brought a tent. I think my cousin was probably pretty happy that I did. The camping trip did not turn out anything like we thought that it would. Immediately, we thought that we were not alone in the woods. My cousin's dad owned the land for square miles and square miles, so no one was supposed to be on it. But there were tons of things that led us to believe that someone else was out there. We heard things, and none of them were very pleasant. I wish I could describe the sounds to you, but other than the sounds of footsteps and breaking twigs, the other things were weird. It was like some human was making strange noises and bird calls with his mouth to scare us, because they definitely were not the real sounds that animals make. Some of the things I could have actually written up to our imaginations. We were trying to have a really fun time, and I think we were looking for things that might not have been there. Sort of like a ghost hunter who goes on a hunt for ghosts, and begins seeing things that really aren't there, but that they want to see. But it began to get weird pretty quickly. On the second day, during the early afternoon hours, we were shocked when the sky started getting darker. Dark, violent storm clouds began moving in, and these weren't supposed to happen. The wind picked up, and the lightning and thunder began streaking and booming in the sky. Because of the absolute speed that the storm was pulling in, and I mean, it was very, very fast, we had to struggle to put up the tent. My cousin had slept outside the previous night and hadn't brought his own tent, but I was going to let him stay in mine for the storm. But because of how fast and how hard the wind was blowing, it was also difficult to try and get the tent up, but we did the best we could. Fortunately, there was a lot of build-up for the storm before the rain hit, so we got into the tent a good time before it. The storm was pretty rough, and it was scary being in that storm. The wind hit hard against the tent, and we thought many times that it would be ripped out of the ground, but somehow it held up throughout the storm. Unfortunately, the tent staying on the ground was the least of all our worries. It was dark outside the tent, but it was still daytime. During some of the lightning strikes, my cousin began to get very paranoid. He thought he had seen someone outside the tent. He kept trying to look through the tent's windows to see if he could get a better look, but mostly it was hard for him to do so. But at one point, I guess he was looking out, when suddenly a bolt of lightning lit up the entire outside of the countryside, and my cousin yelped out in fear, as he must have seen something. He told me there was someone out there in the rain. It was a big guy that he had only seen for a moment, but he was certain that he had seen someone clearly. He was pretty frightened too, which made me wonder what this man must have looked like. I pushed him away and looked out the window too, but I didn't see anything. Even when the lightning flashed out there, I didn't see anyone outside. Not long after my cousin had seen the person, though, something pulled one of the stakes of the tent out of the ground, and part of the tent collapsed. I was worried, but most of the tent was still up, so I thought it was fine. However, another stake got pulled up, and suddenly the entire tent collapsed on the two of us. My cousin kept yelling that someone had to be out there, and had to have pulled up the stakes. He was terrified and wanted to get out of the tent and run. I couldn't stop my cousin, and he was able to get out of the tent. I did too, because I suddenly didn't want to be there by myself. We both began running in the violent storm, doing our best to get home as fast as possible. Turning around, when another bolt of lightning flashed, I was looking back, and there was absolutely someone standing there by the camping area. It was hard to get a good look at him, but it was definitely someone who had torn down our tent. We came back later in the week when it was dry, and we were looking for our stuff. When we found it, it was all torn up. It had definitely been done by a person. We were with my uncle who owned the land and was pissed off as hell that someone had done this on his property. But he was never able to find out who it was or do anything about it. Number 3. Hike. This happened to me when I was going on a few days hike through a park. I don't want to say where it happened exactly because I'm still not very sure what exactly happened, and don't want to speak badly about some place if I can't really know what was happening there. So I went hiking all on my own, but it was a specific hiking trail, and it was not unusual to run into other hikers all the time. But I was also doing this during a time when I had time off from work, and I deliberately picked that time because it was less likely to run into others. But I also liked sticking to official trails, simply because they were safer and it was less likely to get lost. So I tended to do my hiking when others wouldn't be doing theirs. I must have picked a good time hiking through those paths because I wasn't encountering any other people at all. But starting that first evening out there, I began experiencing things that made me feel like I wasn't alone. The first were the sounds of other people walking, but the first few times that I had heard it, it wasn't like I was hearing the walking as if it was coming from the paths. Yet when I looked around, or if I waited to give them time to catch up with me, it never happened. What is more, the sounds would also stop shortly after the time I quit walking. It wasn't really scary though, it was just strange. There were no weird noises or anything at night, that first night, and although I couldn't explain it, I was no longer having the feeling of being watched, or of not being alone. By that point I was just in my tent too, which could have made me feel more vulnerable, but it didn't. So I had a peaceful sleep that first night out. Those feelings didn't last too long, however. The following day things started out much the same, but it got even stranger because a few times I could have sworn that I saw someone when I heard the noises stop, but whomever it might have been, they always stayed far out of the range of my sight. So I could barely tell if I was actually seeing someone there, or if it was my eyes playing tricks on me. It was very disconcerting, and it really just amplified the feeling of being watched, and the fear that came from that. Things got a little weirder that second night, too. At first, I thought it could have been just me being worked up from the whole day. And fear has a tendency to do that, you know. It can work yourself up over time, where your mind can begin playing tricks on you and such, so that unpleasant feeling of being watched only got worse as it got dark outside, and even worse that night when I was trying to go to sleep. Things also didn't get better the next day. Although I was able to get some sleep, I don't think that I ended up sleeping very well, so I wasn't feeling great the next day, and I felt myself getting more paranoid than I already was. Also, once again, I just kept thinking I was seeing something that just kept keeping right out of my view, in which I could see it very clearly. Almost like someone or something knew that I was having a difficult time believing I was alone in the woods, and was preying upon these thoughts. The third evening was when I really began to get a little worried. I actually heard something that I couldn't describe away. While I was just trying to rest in my tent at night, I heard what was undeniably a human being whistling outside in the dark. What made it worse was that it would occasionally stop, and then, when it started back up again, it would start up from a different part of the woods than it had been in before. This truly convinced me that there was someone else out there, and for some reason, this person was messing with me. These sort of things continued into the next day, and it was from the way they continued that kept freaking me out about what had been going on. If I had run into some other hikers, I may have felt better about it, but there was this overwhelming feeling of being alone in these woods, but with some other person somewhere trying to scare me. By the time I was heading back to my car, I came upon a pretty narrow part of the trail. There were branches that had been reaching across the trail, and it was almost grown over, and for some reason, I stopped when I had first seen it. It didn't seem like it was a safe place to walk through, but I had to do it. No sooner had I seen this than I saw the figure once again, this time up ahead of me. He was standing behind the area that I had to walk through and very quickly moved out of sight. I froze and I didn't want to move forward, but I knew I had to in order to get out of the woods and get back to my car. I slowly began walking forward, worried the entire time. I can't even tell you what was going through my mind as I got there. After I squeezed through the area, I noticed something on the ground that terrified me. There was what looked like blood on the ground and some sort of mangled up small animal. I didn't know what it was, though, because it was so torn to shreds. But I knew that it had been left there to either scare me or warn me, and either way, I wanted nothing to do with it. I think a lot of other people might have run the rest of the way out, but I didn't want to do that. I think I would have been more scared if I had been running. I always thought that if something was after me, running would only cause it to run after me faster. So it was just a quiet, an unnerving, and long walk through the rest of the wooded area until I got back to my car. I did get back, and as I drove off, I looked back and once again thought I noticed a black figure standing in the woods. When I got back to the cabin that you had to register in before going into the hiking area, I made sure to make a report of what I had seen. I let him know what I had seen and how the other hiker had been behaving. But for that time, I was the only hiker that had been on that trail. So whomever had been out there was there without permission. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. First I want to thank all my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my two VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I also want to thank Stinking Ooze, EricaOdd, Tracy Sellars, Chronic J, and Heidi H. I just want to elaborate a little bit more on what happened to me last week, just so people who seemed a little worried about it don't have to worry. I am a very heavy sweater. Sometimes I look like a guy who just finished playing a basketball game. So I like to keep my house air conditioned as cool as I possibly can and can afford. But money was a little tight for a month, so I tried to keep it down. And it was really hot in here, and I wasn't able to take in enough water to make up for what I was sweating. So I woke up on Friday morning and I was really sick, continuously vomiting. I was just having problems concentrating. My hands went numb and I was having a really hard time thinking. So my sister called an ambulance and I headed to the hospital. It took about 5 bags of the, I don't know what you call them, but the bags of liquid and they put in the IV to rehydrate you. It took 5 of them to get me rehydrated. And that included drinking several bottles of water and 1 bottle of soda my mom bought me because I really wanted it. When I was able to drink something, of course. But the doctor was a little scared of how badly I was sweating, so he kept me there for a little while, and I didn't have access to a phone or anything because I didn't think when I was going to the ambulance, hey, bring your phone with you. So that was why I wasn't able to tell anybody what was going on, and I do apologize for that. But I'm getting a whole lot of liquids now. I feel really good. I have 2 fans in my bedroom around my desk area to kind of keep me as cool as possible, and I'm trying to get through this heat, and I hope that all of you keep yourself cool and hydrated too, because there's no way I want anyone to feel what I felt. But for now, I hope you enjoy the video and make sure to give it a like or comment on it, and I will do my best to get back to you on the comments. Share it if you think it was good, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you're not subscribed, please go ahead and hit the button and the bell button too, so you'll get notified of new videos. And if you have an original story, please send it to the address in the description. Right now, I want to mention my free Patreon members: Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H., Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, and Evil Black Cat. Thank you all. And if you want to join my Patreon, you can join also as a free member. The link is in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a killer orange cat might be hiding. Good night.